So it is that.
Sitting in the park today with Yuri Polakiwsky. Yuri is a political commentator that lives here in the Ukrainian capital. We're going to be talking about Biden, what it means to be a traitor, and why you're not in government. You've been watching Ukrainian politics for a long time. Joe Biden was vice president in 2014 when Maidan happened and Crimea was illegally annexed by Russia. How has Joe Biden becoming president affected U.S.-Ukrainian relations and U.S.-Russian relations?
I would say that the coming of into the administration, the Biden administration, coming into power, right from the very beginning, there's a clear direction that was not present during the Trump administration. The Trump administration's policy was more transactional, talking about, say, javelins or providing information to go against Biden. So it was a very transactional thing. What you see now with Biden coming in, you see a more of a government-to-government relationship, establishing formal relationships not based on individuals. That's number one. That's a number one change. Number two is that the Biden administration does have a plan for Ukraine. You mentioned that Biden was here a number of times as vice president. That's when he knows the country, he knows the players. I don't know fully that he knows all the changes that have occurred in the last, say, 4 or 5 years, but there is a plan. He's got Blinken and Secretary Blinken and Assistant Secretary Nuland. They know this country. So what has changed fundamentally is that there is a particular plan here, and that plan is to encourage the Ukrainian government to do two things. One, for them to know that they have the support of the United States and that they have a clear support of not only Ukrainian sovereignty and independence, but backed up with defense commitments. That if Ukraine is to go and move forward, a democratic Ukraine move forward, then they want to focus in on that. Sovereignty supported by military action, and secondly, working and dealing with corruption.
Joe Biden knows the area. He's put in well-qualified people that have had experience. But Biden is also a politician of the Cold War, a product of the Cold War. Is his policy going to keep up with the times? Because we're not talking about Cold War anymore. We're talking about hybrid war.
You know, it's very interesting that you asked that question. I think, I believe very strongly that Ukraine is the last chapter of the Cold War. People saying, "Oh, there's a new Cold War." I don't think the I don't think the book on the Cold War is closed. Ukraine is the last chapter, meaning that Ukraine is part of the still seen as I think the last captive nation. Secondly, that they want to escape the sphere of influence before the Soviet Union and Russia. So I think thirdly, to develop a sense of a sovereign and independent democratic Ukraine. So I think it's actually the last chapter. And I think that's what people should think about, that this is a job that still has to be finished. It is part of this idea of the captive nations thing, the sphere of influence. Though a new narrative has to be set up, and that is let's close the chapter of the Cold War, right? And then move on as Ukraine moving on as an independent and sovereign nation, free from the influences of Russia.
When you say it like that, maybe Biden is the right guy for the show.
I think he is. You know, I think he's one of those fellas who's been involved in the Cold War. And I think he knows it. And I think that here is the wonderful opportunity, if you want to talk about internal American politics. This is where both Democrats, Cold Warriors, from the Scoop Jackson tradition, to Republicans can actually say that we want to support a free and independent Ukraine. And this is what one can call a freedom agenda. but I think it's a question of closing the chapter of the Cold War. Now, you mentioned hybrid war. Yes, this is being done in the context of the illegal annexation and illegal war of Russia against Ukraine. So I think we have to be cognizant of the fact that what is incumbent upon the West, not only the United States, about the West, to say that we are with Ukraine, but we are with Ukraine on the basis that it wants to join European institutions, and it wants to be part of Europe or the Western culture. Ukraine is part of Europe. It is not an extension of Eurasia or Asia at all. It's not. It has a historic tradition, constitutional, as well as intellectual tradition that resides in the West, in the Western intellectual tradition. Unfortunately, with its neighbors and its history over the last 100 some odd years, they've been oppressed, and people feel that they can do with Ukraine as they will, and that Ukrainians themselves cannot decide what is in their national interest, and the establishment of what I like to call a modern Ukrainian narrative that's based in democracy, rule of law, and so on.
That's a good transition to our next question, and this is one of Yuri's favorite topics. Ukraine is a poker chip, more or less, of other countries and its own citizens. When Secretary of State Anthony Blinken was here, he described the threat from oligarchs equal to the threat from Russia that they pose on Ukraine's ability to become a modern, perhaps more Western nation. What do you think about oligarchs finally being recognized as this threat?
Well, finally being recognized. One of the things that many don't understand is that I think that you still have a Russian influence, especially in economics and in politics. People who are sympathetic to the Russian, to this idea of Ruski Mir. I would say in Ukraine there are about, I don't want to say as high as 20%, believe in this view of a nostalgic view. A nostalgic view of what was, right? And they're comfortable on that. It's a generational thing. Oligarchs are part of that of a Russian tradition of corruption. That there was not a primary focus, a generational focus, and understanding of what it means or what is required to build a democratic state that's built on rule of law, on free markets. And so you have a continuing class of oligarchs and people who are sympathetic to a way of doing business that is not Western or European for that matter, right? And these people want to continue to exert their power here in Ukraine for largely selfish interests. And this is one of the major problems that prevents the Ukrainian society to be transformed and to be free of selfish economic monopolistic interests.
Why do you think Ukrainians tolerate this idea?
Well, they don't tolerate the idea. The question is, what is it that they can do? They don't tolerate. I mean, the Maidan was a rebellion against oligarchism. It was a rebellion against people, a small coterie of people who had enough power and influence, to maintain a structure and a system of oppression, political, economic, right? And so, although they rejected this idea of oligarchism, both two administrations, both the Poroshenko administration and Zelensky, what they failed to do is they failed to bring in the structures to haven't been able to do this. And the ratings have shown us in Poland up to some 4 or 5 years ago that polled 26,000 people. And the second and the third issue after the war was this demand for and desire for economic justice, number one, and legal fairness. So people here, though they may resent and criticize oligarchs, it's not so much that they want to be oligarchs or they want to become rich. That's not. That's not the primary motivation. Here, Ukrainian people want a sense of economic justice. The fact that I want to have the opportunity myself, or especially for my children, I want them to have the ability to fulfill their life's ambition and have the opportunity to do so. Oligarchs, for example, are monopolists. And what they do is they prevent all the opportunities for investment to take place here because Western companies won't come here or don't come here because there is no established rule of law, right? There is no sense of fairness, or there's no fairness, or there's no sense of protection of the law for people who invest here. So that not only this oligarchism not only affects the aspirations of the people here, but also for potential foreign investment. But it's economic justice that people want, an opportunity.
Now let's jump now from economic freedom to justice and international law. A lot of Ukrainians put high hopes in the Minsk process, and in your words, the Minsk process has completely failed. The Minsk process has to be mourned, in your opinion. Germany and France were unable to create peace. Now, if we bring in the US, Canada, and the UK, will this help?
One of the events that really triggered my view was, for the last number of years, I felt that the Minsk Agreement really wasn't worth the paper it was written on. Minsk Agreement was a Western imposition. It was just for the sake of peace. They had 7 years in which to do this, and it has not been done. The trigger, in my opinion, for its final demise was the 2 weeks before there was the buildup of Russian troops on the Ukrainian border. There was a Zoom call between Putin with President Macron and Angela Merkel. And in that act that excluded Ukraine, there was a feeling that decisions were made for Ukraine behind its back. Is that somebody else is making decisions about our country, as if Ukraine was just a simple borderland that could be used as a chess piece between amongst greater powers. This was a resentment. I think it was a fundamental mistake that people finally said. The Ukrainians finally said, you know what? This is not working for us, because whether Ukraine's going to be part of NATO in the immediate future, I doubt that. I doubt that. However, I like the course that it's taking, in the sense that it's wanting to submit to and to follow the disciplines of NATO discipline, and seeing that it's quite clear that Ukraine does not have, its future is no longer with Russia, that it's not a brotherhood country. You got to get rid of that. There's no brotherhood here. It's the fact that they have two different countries, they have two different and unique cultural identities that are at this point under Putin. They are not similar. The aspirations are national aspirations are totally different. I think that this is a wonderful opportunity for countries like a number of NATO countries to change the dynamics. We want people who will come, or countries that will come and support Ukraine's identity as an independent and sovereign country. That's a totally different discussion than trying to manipulate or talk about amnesty for the Russian-supported fighters, right? Or how voting is going to take place, and so on. This is the business of Ukraine and its own independence. Ukraine determines what it is how they want to live, and the decisions that they make. Not some type of outside force trying to impose a peace plan, if you will, but without justice or meeting the fundamental demands of Ukraine as an independent and sovereign country.
Let's talk a little bit more about this National Security and Defense Council. It's a mechanism that has always been at President Zelensky's disposal, but he's using it more often now. Named one of the key oligarchs here in Ukraine a traitor.
Right. One of the things that is hard, even hard to explain, is that Ukraine, especially here in Kiev, we're sitting here in a park downtown in the center. There's a desire of Russia to impose its will on Ukraine. So Ukraine is at war. Now, regarding the National Security Council, what you're talking about here is to recognize the fact that not only that we are at war, but there are people within this country, right, that are trying to undermine Ukrainian sovereign resolve in their war with Russia. The person that you're talking about is a guy called Medvedchuk, who is who's Putin is godfather to one of his children, and it's been widely reported and assumed that he is kind of Putin's man here. I think what's been recognized that there are enemies within the state, or that are trying or working against Ukraine at a time of war. The not only was it these moves made against Medvedchuk part of the recommendations by the Security Council, but also there was a movement, a prosecutorial and a judicial movement against this man. So, for example, if you just read lately, he's done a number of things. Medvedchuk has. He has provided information, military information, to Russia. He's been profiteering through oil deals in Crimea. So even on the question of the allegation made that he put military secrets, in my opinion, I don't know about you, this is an act of a traitor. So you have to recognize, and I think that Zelensky now, sadly, right, under the pressure of the United States, are clarifying that there are enemies within that want to undermine the sovereignty of the Ukrainian government. These are acts of traitors, especially the one about the military secrets.
These are serious things, and they didn't just happen in the past 2 weeks. This particular person has a long history like this, and an outsider like me may look at this and say, why was this tolerated so long? It could, on the one hand, indicate that Zelensky isn't strong enough to do this on his own, and he needs reassurance from the United States, and he needs to know that they would support this. He closed TV stations right after his first call from Blinken, and after Blinken last visited Ukraine, he cracked down again. Why was he so patient, and what does that say about him and the support of the United States?
I don't think it was a question of what he waited for. I think what it was, I don't think he acted out of weakness. I think he acted out of the fact that they did not know how to do this. My indictment of President Zelensky is that he doesn't know fully what it is that he wants to do. I mean, at the end, when they moved against Medvedchuk, for example, well, here's the reality of it. If it wasn't for the pressure of the Biden administration through Blinken speaking to Mr. Kuleba, who's the foreign minister here, this would not have happened. The president never looked upon as an oligarchic group as a deleterious effect on the development of the country. And I think it's also a generational thing. Understand that there's still people here who have a mentality whereby they have worked, traveled with Russia and so on, and they still cannot fathom that this is actually a country, the Russian Federation, who wants to build its empire, extend its empire, and control what happens in Ukraine. There's still a generational thing here of that being a reality, and people are like, wow, okay, they actually want to kill us. Others talked about the need for reform here, and what they missed is the fact that this country, you couldn't. Reform assumes that you're going to make better what you have already. Okay, that was a big psychological
misassumption, because Ukraine does not need reform. It actually needs transformation. And transformation means that you put in elements within that society that will actually change both the very nature and appearance of the country.
I've been following your writings for some time. I've looked at your career, and I've noticed a trend that oftentimes you write about something, administration changes, policy changes, what needs to be done. And months, if not weeks later, other people have the same good idea. It would make so much sense if people like you, diaspora Ukrainians that are now back in Ukraine, that have something to contribute, would be able to do so in politics. But again, you're an example of someone that is a resource that isn't being utilized. There isn't really any diaspora here in Ukraine like in other Eastern European countries in the early 90s when the diaspora came back and they participated actively. How do you explain that?
Or my mission or my desire to help the country where my parents were born, and to see that country being transformed and becoming what it always can be, a country that's full of creativity, a country that has the potential to feed many nations, that have a society where people want to aspire and to do well and to fulfill their potential. And that's why I'm here. And I hope to contribute to the development of that mentality, and to develop and establish an intellectual framework for the building of a democratic, dignity-based society.
But the other thing is I met with these.
This was Yuri Polakiwsky with me in the park. Thank you very much for spending the afternoon.
That's my pleasure.